Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we continue a process that we've started in May of 2020 to provide meaningful content about the critical issues of our time. We're broadcasting now only once a week because of other extraordinary opportunities that have been brought to Humanity Rising and Ubiquity University, most especially the State of the World Forum, which I hope to touch on at the end of this broadcast. One of the things that I've noted as we've transitioned from one day uh, or 5 days a week to one day a week is that it's hard to know what to put in the one day because the world is changing not only on a daily basis, but during the day, you have to watch the news almost continually just to keep up with the chaos that is being seeded by the forces in governance that are ricocheting around the world. Today, I want to focus on the three seminal events that are taking place that, in my judgment, are really shaping both world governance, world spirituality, and world politics. I want to begin with what is going on in Gaza. I then want to comment on the unfolding events in the Ukraine. And then I want to conclude with a commentary on how the Trump administration is shaping itself and reshaping the United States and the world. All three of these events are interconnected, and they are fundamental for us to understand as we contemplate how we enable humanity to rise in an increasingly turbulent and unstable global situation in which virtually every aspect of human affairs is being upended by events. And probably the safest thing that one can say about current human, personal, global reality is that the center no longer holds. And it's increasingly challenging for us, any of us, to connect the dots. I want to update people on Gaza and the unfolding genocide that is being orchestrated by Israel and the United States, working very, very closely together to exterminate the Palestinian people in every way they can, live on TV. All of you know that since March 2nd, the Israelis cut off all food, water, electricity, and any humanitarian relief to the 2.3 million Palestinians that are crammed together in an area about 5 miles wide and about 25 miles long, adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea, just north of the Israeli-Egyptian border. The starvation that has ensued uh, has been extraordinary. Children are dying by the day. The entire population is on the verge of starvation. There's been no food, no water, no electricity. And at the same time, the Israelis have been conducting, it is estimated, 150 airstrikes a day. And that doesn't count the drones, the artillery bombardment from the tanks. At every level, the Gazans have been subjected to unprecedented bombardment, the most concentrated bombardment in the history of the world. And I want us to just take in for a moment what that means. During the Vietnam War, the United States set a world record, which included the First World War and the Second World War and every other war in history, by putting more bombs into Vietnam than had ever been dropped on any country in the history of the world. And it averaged about 15 tons per square kilometer of the entire country of South Vietnam. The Israelis, in the last 600 days, since the latest intensity of the genocide has been conducted since October 7th, 2023, have dropped an average of 275 tons per kilometer in Gaza. They've literally blown Gaza to smithereens, destroying over 90% of all the buildings. All the hospitals have been taken offline. All the stores, the restaurants, the civic institutions, all the universities, all the high schools, all the primary schools, all the kindergartens have been blown up. It's been unspeakable. And now, do you know what the Israelis in the United States are doing? They call it the Trump plan. In the Israeli Defense Force jargon, it's called Gideon's chariot. Gideon was one of the judges of the ancient nation of Israel. Gideon's chariot, the Trump plan. You may have heard over the last couple of days that the Israelis, bowing to international pressure, have set up 4 food distribution centers. I wondered what this was all about. And so I've been investigating, and this is what's happening. They have 3 centers in southern Gaza, 1 center in central Gaza, administered by the Israelis and the Americans, and they're starving all the people in northern Gaza and giving them a choice. You want food? You want water? You have to go to that food distribution center in central Gaza. And once you get there, you can't go back. They're calling it voluntary movement. They're not forcing the Gazans to leave northern Gaza. They're just starving them to death to force them. If they want to not starve to death and watch their children and their babies and the elderly starve to death, They have to go to that center in the south, and then they can't go back because they're in the process of obliterating northern Gaza so that they can build Trump Plaza. It's a level of evil that can only be called Nazism. The greatest crime in history was what was conducted by the Nazis in the Second World War against the Jews in the Holocaust. That poison has now infected Israel. What's happening in Israel is in full measure equal to the Holocaust that the Germans transacted against the Jews. And the Israelis are now transacting it against the Palestinians. That's what's true, with the full backing of the United States of America and the European nations, the colonial powers, all of whom are guilty of genocide, are supporting the genocide against the Palestinians. I want to deepen this and reflect on the poison of Nazi ideology, an ideology that is intensely racist and believes in the affirmative virtue of genocide. That's what characterized the Nazis. They elevated genocide to a virtue. And I want to read you something that comes out of Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper published in Jerusalem from May 19th, 2025. And the backdrop of this is that it's important for us to remember that most of the high-level Nazis were engaged in the black magic arts, and Heinrich Himmler in particular, who was the head of the Nazi SS, was known as the Hindu Nazi. He always kept a copy of the Bhagavad Gita in his pocket, and he had yoga and meditation exercises taught to the Gestapo and the SS, particularly in the death camps, in the concentration camps, to manage their stress. That was a practice in Auschwitz, in Dachau, in Belsenbergen, and other concentration camps. They taught meditation. What Haaretz is reporting is the following. And I'm going to read it so I get it absolutely correct, because it's hard to believe. Rivka Lefer is a facilitator of workshops, meetups, and group sessions on yoga themes, teacher of feminine yoga, and personal development. She lives in the settlement Shiloh in the southern West Bank and terms herself a proud Jew who thinks outside the box. Lovely. Also, she wants to annihilate and expel 2 million human beings in the Gaza Strip. Lefer belongs to a stream within Israeli Judaism that can be described as yogi Nazis, people whose spiritualism underpins their Nazism. They are a relatively new substratum with deep roots in the local culture, that has gained popularity since October 7th, largely because of its ability to weld together concepts that on the surface seem like polar opposites: spirituality and annihilation, empowerment and expulsion, yoga and starvation, retreats and carpet bombing. LaFair is a person who believes that music has the power to alter our consciousness, but also that expelling and annihilating 2 million Gazans begins with altering one's consciousness. It's very important. Altering one's consciousness. In order to succeed in this important cognitive switch, we have to understand that we have an enemy here whom we look in the eyes and eliminate, she says. Yes, look them in the eyes. Don't do it behind their backs, because we must be in direct and unmediated contact with those that we're annihilating. And to make it clear that by enemy, she doesn't mean only Hamas. She clarifies, quote, "We are committed to take revenge and destroy Gaza from infant to old woman." She tops it off with an appropriate Bible verse: "Thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Thou shalt not forget." The Amalekites were one of the tribes that the Israelites found living in Palestine when they came out of Egypt about 1200 BC. And as you remember, as I've narrated, if you read the book of Joshua in the Jewish Bible, Joshua, in God's name, directed by Yahweh, proceeded to commit genocide against the entire Palestinian population to secure room, Lebensraum, as Hitler put it, for the Jews. The Amalekites were one of the peoples that they tried to exterminate. LaFair understands that people tend to be puzzled when facing this dissonance between spirituality and annihilation. So she, in one of her videos, has, quote, "a message to everyone who doesn't understand how it's possible to be spiritual, to teach yoga and hold retreats, whilst calling for the expulsion and annihilation of your enemy." Indeed, her answer is simple. Quote, "I love my people with an undying love, and I hate my enemy with an undying hatred. One does not contradict the other. One can be filled with the values of love, and at the same time, you also know what is right and what is wrong. You stand firm against your enemy, and you know what must be done with him." The article goes on to talk about other people in Israel. And if LaFair's Nazi spiritualism can be written off, continuing with Haaretz, because she's a settler who's found an efficient solution for realizing the idea of Greater Israel, it's worth noting that this is a far broader phenomenon in Israel that isn't limited to the occupied territories. One day before Holocaust Remembrance Day, stand-up comedian and satirist Gil Kopaz, who has been flirting with spirituality and religion for years, posted the following: "If you feed sharks, they eventually eat you. If you feed the Gazans, they eventually eat you. I support making sharks extinct and exterminating Gazans. These are my reflections for Holocaust Remembrance Day 2025." 25. And after the Post created a storm because it was sent out all over Israel on social media and so forth and so on with great applause from Netanyahu and the right wing, Kopats posted a clarification. I don't have an ounce of compassion for the Gazans. For the Arabs as a whole, yes. For human beings as a whole, yes. For sharks, no. And not for human beasts. Of course, his desire to eradicate millions of people doesn't imply he's a bad person. Indeed, he concludes his post. I consider myself to be a humane, liberal, and moral person. He concludes, it's not genocide, it's pesticide, and it's essential. Close quote. I've mentioned before on Humanity Rising that Carl Jung calls this mass hysteria, that disposition of the psyche in which people can be, at one level, completely normal. Koplatz is a comedian, satirist, very funny, considered a liberal, and considers himself very humane. And at the same time, he believes that genocide is a moral imperative for the Jews, for Israel, to establish greater Israel that God has promised the Jews. And like Joshua, 1200 BC, he believes that genocide against the local peoples, so the Israelites can have Lebensraum, as the Nazis put it, is a moral virtue. That is mass hysteria. That is gripping Israel like it gripped the Germans at the hands of the Nazis. And Donald Trump is in full support. His trip to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates was basically about doing deals to benefit his family, including a $400 million mansion in the sky, the most luxurious 747 ever designed, which is a palace in a 747 that was gifted to him by the emirs of the UAE, the United Arab Republics, as basically a bribe to him personally. So Air Force One is not just two 747s now. It's three 747s because two 747s isn't enough for the gold-plated Donald Trump. It's a level of corruption. It's a level of evil unprecedented in the annals of American history. And I would say, with the exception of the Holocaust in the annals of history, we're witnessing in Gaza a crime of crimes. not only because it's genocide, but because it's being transacted by the very people who went through the greatest crime in history and are now committing it against their own cousins because they won't share the land because they think God gave it to them and that they're special. It's unbelievable. And they're doing it without apology, brazenly, in front of the world. I'll have much more to say about this because I hold the suffering of Gaza closer to my heart than I think anything in the world. I think about it every day, and I mourn and I grieve that my country is actively supporting this with my tax dollars. It's as close to an unforgivable crime as anything that I can think of. Let me turn to what's going on in Ukraine because I think it's very important for us to understand the realities that the same mentality that is actively supporting genocide in Gaza is what is running away from Ukraine. I said 3 years ago in my teach-ins here on Humanity Rising about the war in Ukraine. It was going to end with three inevitable outcomes. The Russians were going to win, the Americans were going to walk away, and Ukraine was going to be destroyed. And that, my friends, is exactly what is happening. The Americans went into Ukraine thinking they could use Ukraine to destroy Russia and fulfill the dream of the neocons, first articulated in the Defense Guidance Memorandum of March of 1992, written by Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl and David Feith, the other neocons in the Bush II administration, that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this was the moment that the United States could abandon the promises that it had made to Gorbachev to create a mutual security zone between Russia and Europe and the United States, and to really destroy Russia, break it up. That's been the plan. So they were moving Ukraine, moving NATO to the east starting in 2004. And then in 2008, they said, we're going to go after Ukraine. And that's when Putin said, that's a red line. It's not going to happen. But the arrogance of the Americans was so extraordinary. They just blew him off. We can do anything we want. You're weak. We're strong. Back to Themistocles, this story of the Peloponnesian War. The strong do what they want, and the weak suffer what they must. That's how the American neocons viewed the Russians. And finally, the Russians took a stand. And 3 years later, after the United States threw in everything it could, with the exception of nuclear weapons, the Russians have prevailed. It was not conceivable to any of the Americans when the war began that the Russians could withstand the high-tech warfare that the US was capable of deploying into Ukraine, combined with the sanctions that were the most pervasive sanctions in history against any country. It was not conceivable that Russia would survive. It not only survived, and its economy is growing, but it's defeated the United States and NATO in Ukraine. And day by day by day, it continues to defeat the Ukrainians and move its forces to the West. Trump is not abandoning Ukraine because he wants to. He's abandoning Ukraine for the same reasons that the Nazis abandoned Russia after their invasion in 1941. And Napoleon abandoned Russia after his invasion in 1812 because they lost. That's the reality, pure and simple. The United States and NATO have lost. And again, as I've said right at the beginning of this latest chapter in the Ukraine war, where the Americans, oh, let's have a ceasefire. What did I say? There's going to be no ceasefire. Ceasefires come after the war's over. They almost never come before the war's over. And the war is not over until two conditions basically are met that Putin has been saying consistently, and most importantly, codified in a very famous speech to the Russian Military Institute on June 24th of 2024. Bottom line, Ukraine has to be neutral. And the world needs to recognize that the Donbass and Crimea are forever now Russia. The Crimeans and the people in the eastern Ukraine voted to be annexed by Russia, and this was done. So in the Russian constitution and in the Russian mind, the Donbass, eastern Ukraine, is now Russia. Crimea is now Russia. And that's not going to change. And the Russians are going to continue to take more and more Ukrainian territory until there's a surrender. And when the surrender happens, then we'll have a ceasefire. But it's not going to happen until these conditions are met. It's not credible for the United States even to propose a ceasefire because it's a co-combatant with Ukraine. It's not like the Pope or Switzerland or Saudi Arabia could come in and say, let's broker an agreement. Let's have a ceasefire and I'll serve as an honest broker. It's like Pope Leo. He's willing to serve as an honest broker for peace settlements or a ceasefire. That's credible. For Donald Trump to propose a ceasefire is not credible because it's the United States that's been using the Ukrainians and is still arming the Ukrainians as we speak. It's an extraordinary situation, but it's absolutely simple. The Russians are now in control. And there's a lot of talk in the news that Donald Trump is just going to walk away and leave it to the Russians and the Ukrainians to sort out. That's exactly how it's going to end. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's what happened in Iraq. That's what happened in Afghanistan, among many other examples that I could cite. At some point, the United States decides it's not worth it anymore. It walks away. And like in Vietnam, it left the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese to just basically work it out. And the next thing you knew, South Vietnam had collapsed. North Vietnam had taken over. And Vietnam is a flourishing country in the world today. And all this propaganda and all this misinformation about the domino theory that if Vietnam falls to the communists, the next thing you know, they were going to be on the doorsteps of Washington, D.C., was a complete fiction. All the discussion of Saddam Hussein being a monster that was, killing children and violating human rights and had weapons of mass destruction and chemical and biological warfare that he was going to unleash on Europe and the United States was a complete, utter fiction. All this discussion of defending Ukraine against Russia and defending civilization because Putin and the Russians were going to take all of Ukraine and then they were going to take over Europe. And the next thing you know, they're going to be here in the United States. If you don't stop them in Vietnam, if you don't stop them in Iraq, if you don't stop them in Ukraine, all is lost. And guess what? None of that was true. The United States is going to walk away, and Russia and Ukraine are going to sort it out. If they'd have sorted it out in 2020, Russia was willing to leave Crimea and leave the Donbass. That's what they negotiated. And they almost signed it in Istanbul in May of 2020. And then Obama, or rather, and Biden put the kibosh on it, said, no, we think you can defeat the Russians. Because the Ukrainians, from the very beginning, like the South Vietnamese, like the poor Iraqis, are proxies for another agenda. In the case of Ukraine, weakening and destroying Russia, and Ukraine was just cannon fodder. And the United States was willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, and they were destroying the country like they did Vietnam and like they did Iraq. And now they're going to walk away, not because they're moral, but because they've lost. That's what's true. That's what's true. And all the stuff in the media is just chaff in the wind. And the reality is, as I've described. And the longer the Americans and the Europeans support the Ukrainians, the more territory Russia is going to take. Finally, they will clearly make it all the way to the Dnieper River, but they may also take Odessa, they may take Kharkiv, they may even take Kiev before they're done. So the longer we ignore and resist the obvious, the worse it is going to be for Ukraine. That's what's true. Which brings me to some comments that I'd like to make on the Trump administration as it's being experienced in the United States. Because again, the same mentality that is committing genocide in Gaza, walking away from Ukraine after devastating that country without a shred, not even an apology. Is what is destroying the United States. The Trump administration, Donald Trump as a person, is breaking down the civic institutions in America in ways that are unprecedented in the annals of American history. This country, of which I'm a citizen, was founded in an act of genius that has been recognized by multiple historians as possibly the greatest act of governance, the greatest architecture of governance in history, with the possible exception of Caesar Augustus's Principate in the transitional moment between BC and AD, roughly coterminous with the life of Jesus of Nazareth. That system of checks and balances is being systematically broken down by an administration which is taking forward the ideology of the neocons as it pertains to the domestic policy of the United States. And I want to emphasize this because it's really important, particularly for Americans to understand in terms of what's happening. This isn't just Trump, crazy man, acting as Michael Moore has said recently, like a Molotov cocktail being thrown into the constitutional system. This is the latest orchestration of a strategic policy begun by Dick Cheney when he was vice president under Bush Jr., called the unitary presidency. The mentality that conceived of the unipolar moment where only the United States was dominant around the world. And that's why they wanted to break up Russia. Russia was the only country that could really challenge America because it's so big and it has nuclear weapons. You break up Russia, you secure unipolar dominance, full spectrum dominance for many, many years to come. The neocons knew that, the Russians knew it, and the Chinese knew it. The corollary to that is you have a unipolar presidency. Just like you don't want to have Russia or China get in your way, you don't want the legislative branch or the courts to get in your way. You want to do what you want to do. And that's what the strategic goal is. It's a unitary presidency. This is a thought form. This is a theory that has been incubated by the Heritage Institute and all the Koch brothers. And because you don't want to deal with all these environmental regulations, you don't want to deal with court orders. You want to rape and pillage without constraint. And that's what the unitary presidency, the unitary executive, listen to Steve Bannon. This is all about breaking down the civic institutions, what Bannon calls the administrative state. So you can build up a strong executive to do whatever it wants. So you attack Harvard, you attack law firms, you attack individuals, whether they're citizens or not citizens, you attack the legislative branch, and you consolidate authoritarian power through intimidation and through fear. You see that at every level of what's going on. This big, beautiful bill that was just passed by the House of Representatives by one vote yesterday, 215 to 214, marked not only the greatest transfer of wealth upwards in American history, while eviscerating any aid to poor people or vulnerable people. School lunches for poor kids, all has been eliminated. 9 to 12 million poor people, elderly people are being stripped of Medicaid. While the Pentagon budget is being increased, where most of the corruption and the waste resides. And there is tax cuts for the rich that are going to increase our deficit by nearly $3 trillion at a moment when the deficit of the United States is getting so massive that the interest, just the interest on the 35 plus trillions of dollars that have been accumulated over the last several decades. We're paying $1 trillion a year in interest. This is bigger. This is as big as the defense budget. It's bigger than entitlements, Social Security and Medicare and government spending for bridges and roads and everything that they do is now being eaten up by interest on the debt. But they are now decreasing taxes. So the government has even less money to pay for it, while they make the rich richer and richer and richer. And now they're starting to cannibalize the poor, because the poor people in this country don't mean much more to Donald Trump and the neocons than the Palestinians in Gaza, or the million Ukrainians that have been slaughtered in a senseless war. And this point must be understood, that the mentality that will generate genocide actively, brazenly, and sacrifice entire nations, whether it's Vietnam or Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Lebanon, Syria, Sudan, you name it. Over 100 countries have been destabilized, destroyed, or somehow manipulated by the U.S. government since the end of the Second World War. It's what the United States has done around the world. And now it's cannibalizing itself because that mentality is now unleashed inside the polity in America. And so, how we understand this, how we connect these dots, is critical for us to understand. And I know this has been a rather stark presentation, but the situation within which we find ourselves is increasingly stark. Two final points. First, remember the Supreme Court last year voted 6-3 that the president is completely immune from any prosecution while he's president of the United States, engaging in official acts. So there's literally nothing any of us can do about it. And in fact, one of the unnoted parts of the $1 trillion budget that was just passed by the House by one vote is to radically weaken the capacity of the courts to hold the government in contempt. You know, the courts don't have armies. So when the Supreme Court makes a ruling, the assumption is that the executive and the legislative branch go along with the adjudication of the court. That's what the Constitution says. Well, what if the President of the United States says no? The only recourse the court has is they can hold the president in contempt. Well, in the bill that they just passed, the courts are going to find it almost impossible to do that. As I've said, this is a strategy. This is not mercurial. Trump's random moves are purely superficial distractions so that people can't keep up with what's really happening. This is quintessential politics as a diversionary tactic. Politics as a magic show so that he calls attention over here, but what he's really doing is over there. And then once you start to figure that out, he does something else to distract your attention. Final point I want to make about Trump is that this mentality was taken to absurd levels in his meeting a few days ago with President Ramaphosa of South Africa, where in the midst of his genocide in Gaza against 2 million people, he accused the South Africans of genocide because there's been a couple of farmers, white farmers, who've been killed. That is not genocide. And Trump had videos ready that were being handed to him by Vice President J.D. Vance with other notables in the room. And he was demanding that the South Africans stop their genocide. And Ramaphosa, you could see, was shocked that the President of the United States would even talk at that level, particularly given what he's doing in Gaza as he plans for Trump Plaza, Club Med. That's an insight into the mentality of not only the man, but the entire administration of Donald Trump. That's what we're dealing with. You know, I was born in China. Right at the time of the Communist Revolution. My parents told me a story that when they got to that area before the revolution, the peasants owed between 200 and 300 years of back taxes to the landlords who had such complete control over the peasants that they could come in at any time and take anything they wanted. If they saw a wife or they saw a daughter, she was compelled to go to his bed that night. No questions asked. When the revolution came, the peasants went to the landlords and in many cases ripped them apart limb by limb. That's not genocide. That is vengeance. That is retribution. And for the president not to understand that after what the whites in South Africa did to the black people, it is inevitable, even with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that there would be the passion of vengeance in isolated areas. The fact that there was only a couple killed is actually a testament to the patience and the mercy and the capacity to forgive on the part of the black population of South Africa. And it's important for us to understand this. Chaos reigns, my friend, and the center does not hold. It's time that we hold hands. It's time, as we're trying to do through the State of the World Forum in December, to connect the dots, to try to assemble a meaning framework of the different data points that are happening in our world. Because if we can simply hold in our awareness the contradictions, we will have some capacity to know how to navigate through the accelerating chaos as it unfolds right before our eyes, affecting all of us in unexpected but in inexorable ways. That's our challenge. And particularly for people of the light, that's our mission. To continue, as I've tried to do today, to simply take a stand and call evil what it is. Evil. And then do whatever we can to bring light into that darkness. And that's why we continue with Humanity Rising. So thank you, everyone, for your patience with me today. I feel so deeply about these issues, particularly the suffering of the Gazans, those poor Palestinians that are being starved and bombarded 24/7, now for 600 continuous days. Let us hold them in our hearts. That'll bring our session to a close. I'll be happy to join the after chat. For those of you who would like to deepen this conversation for a little bit, you'll see the link for the after chat in the chat box. You received the link in your Zoom reminder for today. These are deep issues in a very critical time of great gravity for our species. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you next Friday. Bye for now.